Hi, everybody, and welcome back to lecture 2 of the cardiovascular system. So we are going to talk about today the blood vessels and capillaries. So I had spoken before about how there are 3 major components of the cardiovascular system: the heart, the vasculature or the vessels, and the blood. So today we're going over the vasculature. So we often talk about vessels, but these can be broken down into different components, namely the arteries and the veins and the capillaries. So before I go any further, I've been showing you documents and diagrams that have certain aspects of the cardiovascular system depicted in red and certain aspects of the system depicted in blue. Okay, this is not because there's blue blood and there's red blood. All blood is red. It becomes more red if it's oxygenated, and we'll talk about that in the blood section next. So in these diagrams, blue is depicted as deoxygenated blood, or blood that's carrying carbon dioxide, and that is coming from the body where it has deposited the oxygen for tissues. Red blood is depicted oxygenated blood, and that comes from the lung where that blood is picking up oxygen. So just keep in mind, there's no blue blood, at least in mammals. There are actually some like mollusks and things that do have, squid have blue blood. So we'll talk about that potentially on Monday. Okay, so when we break down the vasculature, it's actually broken down to tons of different tiny components. Okay, so the biggest things that you need to take note of is the fact that there are vessels that are coming from the heart and there's vessels that are going towards the heart. Vessels that are coming from the heart are first the arteries. These are the largest vessels. I told you already that the aorta is the largest artery in the body. So from the heart, there's a ton of pressure, and that heart is pumping blood at a really high load. And so these arteries, the closer they are to the heart, they're more elastic in order to be able to deal with that pressure. As you get further down, away from the heart, they are termed as muscular arteries. And so as you're going, let's say down your arm or down your leg, you're going to have main large arteries that are termed muscular arteries. They're going to have a layer in their tissues that's more muscular. The arteries then branch out into arterioles. Okay, so the arterioles are just smaller arteries. Okay, they don't have as many of these layers because they don't have to be pumping as much blood or be as flexible, but they do have a lot of smooth muscle cells around them because they're still pumping blood at a faster rate than what's being pumped in the veins. Okay, so when we go from arterioles down to the lowest level, then we're talking about capillaries. Okay, so we have coming from the arterioles down, we have capillaries that are termed continuous capillaries. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but there is fenestrated or continuous capillaries based on how the oxygen needs to be exchanged at these sites. Okay, so suffice for now to say we have arteries to arterioles to capillaries. Now, one good way to remember that the vessels that are coming from the heart are going away from the heart is A for artery and A for away. So arteries go away from the heart. Okay, so now that we've gone down to the capillary level, we exchange that oxygen, or the red blood cells will exchange oxygen at that level. And so we then move to the fenestrated capillaries, or the capillaries on the side that is now going towards the heart. Okay, so we start now on the lowest level, capillaries, the tiniest vessels. Those capillaries deliver blood into venules, so small veins. The venules, which also are less thick tissue because they're pumping lower volumes of blood, then move on to medium and then to large size veins. Okay, so venule for small vein. These small veins push blood into larger veins, so medium sized and large veins. Okay, so these tissue layers of the different vessels, I touched on this a little bit, but mostly this is based on the functions that they serve. So the more blood, the higher the volume, the more layers those vessels are going to have. So let's start with the outer layer, the tunica externa. And so over here, I'm sorry, my little video icon is probably covering this, but the arteries, the elastic arteries, are going to have an internal elastic membrane that is part of the internal layer here, and then the external and the medial layer. So tunica externa, you will sometimes see this called adventitia. So tunica externa or adventitia, that contains the connective tissue. The tunica media, this is the thickest layer of the vessels. So this is actually the muscle layer. So the muscles control vasocontraction or vasoconstriction, right? Meaning contraction, vasoconstriction or vasodilation, sorry. Vasoconstriction meaning that the vessels are getting tighter. Vasodilation meaning they're getting wider and looser. So there's muscles that control the width of these vessels. Then we get to the internal layer, this tunica intima. So this contains mostly endothelial cells. So the endothelium is this layer of cells that lines the vessels. These cells are directly in contact with the blood. The internal layer, that sort of hollow portion, is termed the lumen. Okay, so that's the interior of the vessel. So the inside that carries the blood is called the lumen. The next layer is the endothelial layer, termed the tunica intima. And then the tunica media, which is that muscular layer that controls the vasodilation and vasoconstriction. And then the tunica externa, which is mostly connective tissue. Okay, so the reason for all the different types of tissue layers around the different areas of the heart and within the different vessels all across the body is because the blood has to flow from high to low pressure. Okay, so lots of fluids flow high to low pressure. We'll talk about how gases also flow high to low pressure. So blood has to be pushed from the heart, this is a high pressure area, to the rest of the body, to these low pressure areas. Okay, so the areas where you're going to have high pressure are the arteries, as I mentioned, that's why you need them to be more elastic, into the arterioles, then into the capillaries, which spread out and feed all your areas of the tissues, back to the venules, and then the veins, which go back to the heart. Okay, so the way that you can look at these different sections of vessels or different categories of vessels, you can look at how their form follows their function. So elastic arteries, as I mentioned, they're going to be the widest in diameter, okay? And then muscular arteries are a little less wide, arterioles less wide, capillaries the very tiniest, skinniest in diameter. Back to the venules, the veins, and then the vena cava, which are feeding back into the heart, okay? So you can see how the vessel diameter going away from the heart gets smaller, then going back towards the heart gets larger. When this graph talks about the cross-sectional area, that really just means the quantity. How many are there of these different types of vessels across the body? There's fewer elastic arteries and muscular arteries and arterioles until you get to the capillary level. These capillaries you're going to have a lot of because they're just so tiny. They're going to be kind of spidering across a vast area of expanse all through your body and all through different tissues. And so this is going to be the largest number, square footage overall, of vessels. So the capillaries take up the most space. Then the venules and the veins are going to take up a little bit of space, but you can see now when we go down towards the vena cava, back towards the heart, there's fewer and fewer of those types of vessels. Okay, so pressure. When I talk about high to low pressure, you can see exactly what this means here. So the elastic arteries are going to be having the highest pressure inside those vessels. to the muscular, to the arterioles. Now we're going down in pressure to the capillaries, to the venules, the veins, and the vena cava. So this just goes in one direction, from high to low, okay? So the pressure in the veins has to be greater than the pressure of the heart in order for the veins to be able to return to the heart. So I'll talk in a second about how exactly that's achieved. But let's talk really quickly about velocity. So this is one way that pressure kind of coordinates with blood flow overall. So the higher the pressure, usually the faster the blood is moving. So fast blood, high velocity, high pressure from the heart going really fast. When it's got to slow down when it goes through the tiny, tiny, skinny little diameter tubes, these capillaries, back through the veins and the vena cava. Eventually that velocity is going to speed up in order to be able to actually get much more blood volume back to the heart. Okay, so how do we solve this issue of high to low pressure? So there is specific blood flow mechanics of the venous system. So this is essentially anything from the capillary level onwards, venules, veins, that is termed the venous system. To achieve the high to low pressure flow, we have two ways. And so this is termed venous return. Okay, so to achieve the venous return, so to overcome the fact that this is low pressure by the time we get to the venules, the veins, and the vena cava, but we have to somehow increase the velocity, is the pressure in the aorta during diastole is very low. Okay, so now we're looking at a pressure graph across the systemic and pulmonary systems. Okay, so you can see pressure high to low. Okay, that's exactly the same pressure graph that I'm showing you up here in the corner, high to low. However, this graph shows us now we're back at the heart. So this section here that's unlabeled, this is the heart. So once we're back in the heart, pressure increases because that heart is pumping then from the right ventricle out into the pulmonary artery. Pulmonary artery is going into arterioles and capillaries and capillaries within the lungs. Then those capillaries and venules and pulmonary veins all go back to the heart from the lungs. Okay, so this pulmonary circuit here, you can see there's a little bit of boost of pressure just to help it get through the lungs to the point where it comes back to the heart. Okay, so one way we can get venous return is because by the time we reach the heart, we have a very low pressure in the atria. So we're still able to follow that high to low pressure because the atria is lower than the vena cava or the pulmonary veins. Okay, the second way that we can achieve venous return is from actual physiological pumps, which increase the pressure in the veins. Okay, so how does this work? Well, veins are the only vessels in your body that contain valves. Okay, these valves work similar to the valves that are in the heart. They allow blood to move forward, but not backwards. Okay, so when we have valves, it is allowing that blood flow, once it's pumped up into that vein, that pushes the valve open and then the valve slams shut. And so we can almost sort of squeeze one by one, pump the blood up through those veins. What serves as the pump is the muscle. So talked a little bit about skeletal muscle in the sections prior to this. So your skeletal muscle actually helps you contract those vessels so that you can push blood up through the veins. Okay, so each time you are, let's, for example, talk about walking. So a leg at rest, your veins are going to be open and not really pushing anything. A leg in motion, however, you're going to be contracting some of these muscles over here. And so when you zoom in, you can see how there's actually a push of blood up through those valves, and that allows that pump to pump blood up towards your heart. Okay, because it's kind of going opposite of the direction you're having to go against gravity. Now, when we're talking about the lungs, we don't really have muscles in the lungs the same way we have muscles in our extremities. So there's a respiratory pump when we get to the lungs, and I'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into the respiration lectures. But essentially, the muscles that are in your ribs and in your diaphragm, which allow you to breathe in, breathe out, are also allowing the blood in your veins in that area to pump through and slowly make progress back towards your heart. Okay, so that's it for this section. I want you all to be able to understand the different types of vessels, describe the basic tissue layers of the vessels, and understand these blood flow mechanics. So understand the pressure gradient, high to low pressure, and understand the different ways that venous return is achieved. Okay, if you have questions, if there's any muddy points, anything I need to clarify, please come prepared to class on Monday on October